Hey guys, so this is the first in a series of screencasts where I'm going to be going over several things that are going to be really important at this phase of the research paper, going from, sort of all the planning that we've been doing and the outlining and the getting ready to, okay, how does this turn into an actual um, paper with paragraphs and whatnot. So I'm going to be covering three different topics in three different screencasts, and this one is basically about what your section 2 is going to look like. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And the thing that I'm pulling up right now actually probably looks familiar to you, particularly for those of you who are literally on here right now because you're working on your outlines. I shared this with you guys last week to kind of help you out with the outline because I thought it would be helpful to see how an outline fits into like how it looks. And so this is a sample I did for one of my sub issues. I didn't develop all of them. So this would be probably about half or about a third or somewhere in between of my section 2. This contains multiple parts. It's got some they say and it's got I say. An actual section 2 would do kind of the same thing for more than one sub issue. But I wanted to show you a couple of things on here, which is how I go back and forth between the they say and I say, where I'm talking about the book versus where I'm talking about my resources, what I'm saying about them and where I say comes into it and that kind of thing. So just a couple of sort of housekeeping things that I would point out is one, anything you see in yellow is I say, and anything you see in blue is they say. And what you're going to notice as we go through here is that most paragraphs are one or the other. And I kind of go back and forth. We've got a little bit here where it's mostly they say, and then I have some I say. And then I start off with a little bit of I say, but I go into they say. So we really do have a kind of back and forth here. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is everything that's underlined. You should recognize as a they say, I say template-like language. And so as you can see, it's all over the place throughout here. So that's another goal of this paper. They say, I say is the point, not that we're just reporting out on what sources said, but we have something ourselves to say about it. We're the ones who are doing the synthesis and bringing it all together. So I'm just going to read this out loud to you and kind of tell you sort of how sub-narrate kind of how it's working along. So I start off with a little bit of an intro here. And I introduce the issue, and I say one of the issues I found most interesting in the book was when Pertman explores the fact that most people who come to the adoption process have already suffered through the harrowing experiences of infertility. Of course, this idea would seem to come with a great big, well, duh, but I hadn't really considered that this history would have a profound impact on the new experience of adoption. Coming myself from this experience, I thought it was important to dig into this issue further to see what extra challenges might lie ahead. So that paragraph's all I say, and it's basically an introduction getting me into what the book had to say about it. Pertman explains this from his own experience with how people treat infertile couples who are considering adoption. He maintains that adoptive parents get accused of being selfish, only out for their own desires. After going through the brutal infertility struggles, Pertman complains that people would criticize their decision to move on to infant adoption, including the very people who were supposed to be helping them with the process. He says, "It's hard for me to hear another earnest social worker chant the reformist mantra that adoption should be all about finding parents for children, not children for parents." Pertman 167. Obviously, Pertman is aware of the fact that the child's needs should be at the center of the conversation, but he felt as though adoptive parents' needs and desires were being automatically discounted as invalid. According to Pertman, it felt like they were, quote, being asked to pay the price for violating a social norm, as though our feelings of shame and embarrassment or inadequacy aren't penalty enough. We're supposed to swallow our loss, internalize our pain, and move on. 167. These reactions certainly added to the Pertman stress during the adoption process, and I think they would give any potential adoptive parent pause. After all, no one wants to be shamed when they're already going through an arduous process. So in this case, I spent a good deal of time on they say, a couple of different things that he said, and then I make just a very brief commentary about it. I sort of bring it a little bit around to the bigger perspective, which is this idea of being shamed and going through this really tough process. And then I use that as kind of a transition into where my research went. And I say, but it felt like Pertman only scratched the surface of the post-infertility adoption experience. So I set out to learn more about it. And so basically what you see right here in this yellow I say is a transition from, okay, here's what the book said about it, to, okay, but I wanted to look further, and here's what I found when I looked further. Now, the one thing you're going to notice as I move down here when I looked further is I found a couple of things that this extra source said, and I used them both, but I separated them by some I say. So I set out to learn more about it. I found a study done by Judith Daniluk and Josh Hertig Mitchell called Themes of Hope and Healing, Infertile Couples' Experiences of Adoption. That was published in the Journal of Counseling and Development. Daniluk is a researcher from the University of British Columbia who has worked for 15 years as a counselor for infertile couples. She and Hertig Mitchell, her graduate student, interviewed 39 couples who pursued adoption after struggling with infertility. Their study put into words a few ideas that have been nagging at me. First, the interviewed couples reported a sense of powerlessness that influenced their difficult decision to pursue adoption. Couples were hesitant because, as the researchers stated, they were entering the adoption process at precisely the time they were beginning to regain some control, and were afraid that the adoption process, quote, could have the potential to reopen wounds that had already begun to heal. Daniluk and Hertig Mitchell, 393. As it turns out, these fears were not unfounded. These couples lamented what they called the, quote, almost whimsical nature of the process, in which they felt, like Pertman, that they had little control over their outcomes. They ultimately didn't regret their decision to adopt, but still remembered the stress of the process. Before I move on to I say here, I want to point out, so much of this is top bun, right? Don't forget about the top bun, meat and pickles, bottom bun. I set it up. I explain who these people were, the title of their study, where it was published, what their backgrounds are, sort of what they did, and sort of what their overall points were. All of that still needs to be included here. We can't forget about it just because we're in a bigger paper. And then we get into the sort of the quotes, the exact things, the quotes and paraphrase. And then as I get down to the bottom here, I've got bottom bun, right? Especially even here, I'm connecting it to Pertman, my original source, my book source. And I'm kind of wrapping it up before moving it on to my I say. And then I comment on this, and I say, as someone considering adoption, this concerns me greatly. After 5 years of infertility and multiple losses, it's difficult to jump into another journey of uncertainty. One of the worst parts of our experience so far was the lack of control, feeling like there was nothing we could do to influence the outcome. I'm not sure this fear would prevent me from pursuing adoption, but it would definitely make me take a pause and perhaps give myself time to build up my defenses before diving back into the fray. So what I've done here is sort of connected it to my own experience, which you may or may not have with your issue. But I sort of came to some conclusion, okay, what does this mean to me? How am I going to take what I've just learned and apply it? The other thing I want to point out was I brought up this, one of the worst parts of the experience so far was the lack of control. That was actually something that they were talking about up here. So remember, we have to make sure that our I say matches up with our they say. And right here it does. All right, but I wasn't done with this source yet. So I transitioned back to a they say. Another point made by Daniluk and Hertig Mitchell was that adoptive parents need to make a host of decisions that most parents don't need to make, such as what kind of adoption to pursue, how old of a child they want, or if they're willing to be matched with a special needs child or one of a different race, 394. Most parents just take what they get, so to speak. Having all these additional decisions puts an extra pressure onto adoptive parents who agonize over how their feelings on these issues might impact their wait time or their lives moving forward. One example of how these concerns combine, the researchers recount, is through the home study, a detailed investigation into a couple by a social worker. One of the respondents in their study pointed out that, quote, most parents don't have to pass any tests to have children, 394. These adoptive parents expressed frustration with the lack of respect they received during the endless process of jumping through hoops, after they'd already endured so much pain and humiliation during their infertility. My I say, where I respond to this idea of being frustrated with the lack of respect and sort of these extra challenges, is I can see where these parents are coming from. The home study is the most terrifying aspect of this prospect. It's hard to not feel insecure when you know someone is going to be going through your life with a fine-tooth comb. Even if you know you have nothing to hide, you wonder what innocuous thing might be a black mark against you if someone is closely scrutinizing. But furthermore, the injustice of it all really nags at me, which I feel is just a continuation of my feelings during infertility. When I'm feeling petty and insecure, I get angry. From where I'm sitting, it looks like everyone can have a baby at the drop of a hat, even drug addicts and careless teenagers, and people without the financial or emotional means to care for them. And here we are, relatively stable, responsible adults, and we're the ones who have to go through this awful, invasive, expensive, humiliating process. It just seems so unfair, and it's unnerving that the adoption journey would add to our already frayed feelings of indignation on the subject. Okay, so you can see that I ended with quite a bit more I say. In fact, my I say up here, other than my intro, was kind of minimal. But as I went down, I got a little bit more in depth, and I started having more to say about the subject. That's where I'm synthesizing. I also want to point out to you guys that as I get down here, I start connecting it back to this is post-infertility, which was kind of where the issue that I found that I started out looking at. And I came down to, here we are and we've been through all of this. So have these people. And then we have to deal with this other, as some call it, indignity on top of that. So I just wanted to point out, I wanted to walk through this with you and kind of lead you through what I was doing in each paragraph, show you the they say, I say, show you the templates. I just wanted you to kind of see how it all sort of works and flows together. As I said, if you did the outline or if you looked at the outline, this should look pretty familiar to you. And hopefully this sample, if you were feeling a little bit wishy-washy on it, hopefully this sample will help you out, right? The next thing we're going to talk about is how to integrate quotes into sentences appropriately. It's something that I know students know how to do, but they tend not to do very well when left to their own devices. So that is our next point to make. And we're going to use this one as an example again to some degree, but that'll be in the next screencast.